In the early 2000s, Microsoft looked unbeatable. Windows dominated personal computing. Office controlled workplaces. Developers built software around Microsoft's ecosystem because that was where the users were. And during that same period, Microsoft openly mocked Linux. Former Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer famously called Linux a cancer in 2001 because of the way open-source software licenses worked. But while Microsoft treated Linux like a fringe threat, one person kept warning that the real danger to Microsoft wasn't Linux itself. It was Microsoft's dependence on controlling everything.
I just think that Microsoft isn't out there to make the world a better place.
That person was Linus Torvalds. And years later, something remarkable happened. Microsoft didn't destroy Linux. Microsoft slowly transformed into a company that depended on Linux. Today, Linux powers much of the internet, dominates cloud infrastructure, runs Android, and plays a massive role inside Microsoft's own Azure business. So when people say Linus Torvalds predicted Microsoft's downfall, they do not mean Microsoft went bankrupt. They mean the old Microsoft lost. The company that believed Windows would remain the center of computing forever eventually had to abandon that worldview. And the strange part is that Linus saw the weakness long before most people noticed it. By the late 1990s, Microsoft had built one of the most dominant technology empires in history. Windows ran on the overwhelming majority of personal computers worldwide. Businesses depended on Microsoft Office. Internet Explorer crushed Netscape during the browser wars. PC manufacturers almost universally shipped computers with Windows pre-installed. For many people, Microsoft and personal computing were practically the same thing. And internally, Microsoft believed its biggest strength was platform control. The company controlled the operating system, the software ecosystem, and the developer environment all at once. That strategy worked brilliantly during the PC era, but it also created a hidden vulnerability because Microsoft's future depended on one assumption that the PC would remain the center of computing. Linus Torvalds increasingly believed that assumption would eventually fail. Back then, that sounded ridiculous. The average person used Windows every day. Linux barely existed in public conversation outside developer communities and technology forums. Even many experts assumed Linux would stay confined to hobbyists and enterprise servers. But Linus was paying attention to something much bigger than desktop popularity. He was watching how software ecosystems evolve. And in his view, open systems had a long-term advantage because they could adapt faster than closed corporate platforms. That idea became increasingly important as the internet started reshaping the technology industry. One thing often misunderstood about Linus Torvalds is that he never acted like a revolutionary trying to destroy Microsoft. He was usually far more pragmatic than people expected. Over the years, Linus repeatedly argued that open source development worked because it allowed software to evolve faster, adapt more efficiently, and improve through distributed collaboration instead of centralized corporate control. That mattered more than most people realized. At the time, Microsoft's dominance depended heavily on tightly controlled proprietary systems. Linux represented the opposite philosophy entirely. Anybody could modify it. Anybody could contribute to it. Companies could adapt it for their own infrastructure without waiting for permission from a single corporation. Linus did not need Linux to replace Windows on every desktop computer. He believed open systems would naturally spread wherever flexibility and scalability mattered most. And in many interviews, he sounded strangely unconcerned about desktop market share compared to Linux enthusiasts online. That confused people. Many Linux supporters treated the competition with Microsoft almost like a sports rivalry. Linus often seemed less interested in winning against Windows and more interested in building technology that people could freely improve. That difference in mindset turned out to matter enormously, because while Microsoft focused on protecting an empire built during the PC era, the internet was quietly creating a completely different future. In the early Linux versus Windows debates, most people focused on desktop computers. That turned out to be the wrong battlefield. Because while consumers still cared about PCs, the internet was quietly changing how technology worked underneath everything. Servers became more important. Web applications reduced dependence on operating systems. Cloud infrastructure started replacing traditional software models, and Linux was perfectly positioned for that transition. Companies running large-scale internet infrastructure needed systems that were stable, customizable, and cost-effective. Linux fit those needs extremely well. As companies like Google, Amazon, and Facebook expanded globally, Linux spread rapidly throughout the infrastructure powering the modern internet. Most consumers barely noticed this happening because they still used Windows PCs. But behind the scenes, Linux was becoming foundational to modern computing, and this is where Microsoft's real problem emerged. The company had spent years optimizing itself around protecting Windows dominance, while the industry itself was gradually moving beyond the PC-centered world that created Microsoft's power in the first place. That created tension inside Microsoft. The company still made enormous money from Windows and Office, so every major strategic decision revolved around protecting those products. But technology industries rarely stay frozen. The rise of smartphones weakened the importance of desktop operating systems. The rise of cloud computing weakened the importance of local software installations. And the rise of web platforms weakened Microsoft's ability to lock developers into Windows-specific ecosystems. At the exact moment computing was becoming more internet-centered, Microsoft remained heavily tied to the business model of the PC era. That was the structural weakness Linus understood earlier than most people. One of the clearest examples of Microsoft's problem appeared during the smartphone explosion. When Apple introduced the iPhone in 2007 and Google expanded Android shortly afterward, the center of personal computing started shifting away from desktop PCs. Microsoft had opportunities in mobile. The company launched Windows Mobile and later Windows Phone. But neither platform gained enough momentum to seriously challenge iOS or Android, and the irony was impossible to ignore. Android itself used a modified Linux kernel. So while Microsoft struggled to stay relevant in mobile computing, Linux technology was quietly spreading into billions of devices worldwide. This mattered because smartphones fundamentally changed user behavior. People no longer depended entirely on Windows PCs to access the internet, communicate, consume media, or run applications. The operating system monopoly Microsoft once relied on became less important. Apps and cloud services became more important than the desktop itself. Microsoft was not collapsing financially during this period, but its old strategic advantage was weakening. The company was no longer defining the future of computing the way it had during the 1990s. And Linux-based systems were increasingly involved in the technologies replacing Microsoft's old dominance. The turning point was not ordinary consumers switching operating systems. It was developers changing how they built software. For years, Microsoft had been the natural center of software development. But as the web expanded, developers increasingly gravitated toward open-source tools and Unix-like environments. Technologies like Git, Python, Docker, Kubernetes, and Node.js grew inside ecosystems that aligned naturally with Linux and collaborative open-source culture. At the same time, web applications weakened Windows' traditional advantage. If software runs primarily inside a browser or in the cloud, the operating system underneath becomes less important. That dramatically reduced Microsoft's old platform leverage. And Microsoft eventually realized something dangerous. If developers stop prioritizing your ecosystem, your long-term dominance starts weakening, even if consumers still use your products. This was exactly the kind of structural shift Linus Torvalds had understood early. The future battle was never just about desktop market share. It was about who shaped the infrastructure and development culture of modern computing. And for a while, Microsoft struggled badly with this transition. Many developers viewed the company as resistant to open-source software. Meanwhile, Linux communities and open-source ecosystems increasingly became the places where modern development culture evolved. That cultural shift mattered just as much as the technical one. Because once developers emotionally invest in a different ecosystem, platform loyalty starts changing across the industry. Then came the part almost nobody would have believed 20 years earlier. Microsoft stopped fighting Linux and started embracing it. The company integrated Linux into Windows through the Windows Subsystem for Linux, or WSL. Microsoft became a major contributor to open source projects. It acquired GitHub, the platform at the center of modern software collaboration. Most importantly, Microsoft's cloud business increasingly supported Linux because customers demanded it. This was not ideological. It was survival. Microsoft understood that modern developers and enterprise customers no longer wanted to live entirely inside closed ecosystems. And nowhere was the irony greater than Azure. At one point, Microsoft executives publicly acknowledged that a majority of Azure virtual machine cores were running Linux-based operating systems. The same company that once treated Linux as an existential threat eventually depended heavily on Linux workloads inside one of its most important businesses. That would have sounded absurd during the height of Microsoft's anti-Linux era. But it happened because the industry changed in the exact direction Linus believed it eventually would. And this was the key detail many people missed. Linux did not beat Microsoft by replacing Windows on every desktop. Instead, Linux became too important for the modern technology industry to ignore. Eventually, Microsoft had no realistic choice except adaptation. Did Linus actually predict Microsoft's downfall? Not in the dramatic Hollywood sense. Linus Torvalds never predicted Microsoft would disappear, and Microsoft clearly survived. Under Satya Nadella, the company successfully reinvented itself around cloud computing, subscriptions, enterprise services, and AI. Financially, Microsoft became enormously successful again. But the original Microsoft worldview collapsed. The belief that Windows would permanently sit at the center of computing collapsed. The belief that proprietary control would dominate software development collapsed. The belief that open source could be ignored collapsed. That is the downfall people are talking about. The old Microsoft lost so thoroughly that the company eventually had to adopt many of the ideas it once resisted. And in that sense, Linus Torvalds was remarkably accurate far earlier than most people realized. In some ways, Microsoft's transformation became indirect proof that the industry itself had changed. If Microsoft had truly remained dominant under its original model, it would never have needed to integrate Linux into Windows, support open-source ecosystems so aggressively, or reposition itself around cloud infrastructure. The company adapted because the market forced adaptation. And that is exactly what happens when a technological paradigm shifts. Even today, many people misunderstand how Linux won, because they still think the story was about desktop operating systems. It wasn't. Linux never needed to dominate consumer desktops to reshape the technology industry. Instead, it became deeply embedded in the infrastructure underneath modern computing, like internet servers, cloud platforms, mobile operating systems through Android, developer tooling, enterprise infrastructure, supercomputers, and containerized environments. Most users never directly interact with Linux in obvious ways, but huge parts of modern digital life run on systems influenced or powered by Linux technologies. And that outcome aligned closely with how Linus Torvalds viewed software evolution from the beginning. Open systems spread gradually because industries adapt to practicality, not because of marketing slogans. That is one reason Linux became so influential despite never fully conquering the desktop market. It solved problems that mattered deeply to developers, infrastructure engineers, cloud providers, and internet companies. And once those sectors standardized around Linux-based ecosystems, the momentum became incredibly difficult to reverse. By then, the technology world had already changed underneath Microsoft's original business model. What makes this story important is that it was never only about Microsoft. It revealed a larger pattern in technology. Dominant companies often assume the systems that made them successful will remain permanent. They optimize around protecting existing products and existing business models. But technology shifts can quietly change the foundations underneath entire industries long before the public notices. That is exactly what happened during the rise of Linux and open source software. The change did not arrive through one dramatic moment. It happened gradually through developers, infrastructure, cloud computing, and internet architecture. By the time Microsoft fully adapted, the industry had already moved into a world where Linux and open source ecosystems were too important to ignore. And that is why the story of Linus Torvalds matters so much today. He understood earlier than most people that control alone does not guarantee long-term dominance in technology. Sometimes adaptability matters more. And that lesson now applies to every modern tech giant. No company stays untouchable forever. Not operating systems, not smartphone platforms, not social networks, not even AI companies. Technology industries move incredibly fast once developers, infrastructure standards, and user behavior begin shifting together. And history repeatedly shows that companies protecting yesterday's model often struggle to recognize tomorrow's one until the transition is already happening. At the height of Microsoft's power, Linux looked like a side project created by programmers for programmers. Meanwhile, Microsoft looked permanent. But Linus Torvalds understood something most people missed. The future of computing would not belong entirely to one company controlling one operating system. It would belong to flexible ecosystems, internet infrastructure, cloud platforms, and collaborative software development. And once the industry moved in that direction, Microsoft's old model stopped fitting the future. The company survived by transforming itself. But that transformation itself became proof that the original Microsoft strategy had reached its limits, which leads to one of the most ironic outcomes in tech history. Microsoft spent years trying to defeat Linux, then eventually had to build its future alongside it.